Welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Traver, and in this video, I'm going to take a look at the notoriously difficult text of Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14, 15, and 16. Let's take a look. Okay, I would totally say up front, one of the things you need to probably do is stop the video, get yourself a cup of coffee or some tea or something. I might have a couple sips every once in a while. I'm just going to walk you through in a dialogical way this text because that's the way it's got to be done. Just got to work through it just step by step. Could this be death by PowerPoint? Maybe. I don't know. But at the same time, I just want to be slow and have you understand. All right, so the Apostle Paul writes, "For he himself is our peace, who made both groups one and broke down the dividing wall of the partition by abolishing in his flesh the enmity, the law of commandments contained in ordinances." That's kind of the really big sticking point there. "So that in himself he might create the two into one new man, making peace, and might reconcile them both in one body to God through the cross, having in himself put to death the enmity." All right, so there's this enmity, this bad mojo, this vibe that exists between these two groups, and in Messiah Yeshua, in Jesus, that was abolished. It was torn down. So these are the parts of the text that I think we need to unpack for us to get at Paul's intended meaning. And that's what we're looking at. So here are the questions. Who is the he here? Who are we talking about? I think we all know that that is God, but let's do our due diligence and just make sure that's what it is. Who are these two groups that the Apostle Paul is referring to? Does the text tell us? What's the dividing wall? And then finally, what's the law of commandments contained in ordinances? Is that the same as the dividing wall? What's going on here? So this little first part here, who is he? Well, if you look in the beginning of the letter to the Ephesians, blessed be God the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, so if you continue to read through the text, it becomes clear that the he in this instance is referring to God, Yahweh, Yehovah, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Now, I think the way that the Apostle Paul has phrased this is he is certainly writing to the Gentiles in Ephesus, to the Ephesians, but he knows that his Jewish brethren are going to be overhearing, so to speak, reading this letter as well. They haven't found Jesus, many of them, that Jesus is the Messiah, and so he wants them to know he's talking about Yahweh here, and that Yahweh is tied to Jesus. Now, I'm a monotheist, as Paul is a monotheist, and that said, he's just separating them out because he wants to clearly link Jesus with Yahweh. And there you go. Okay, these two groups, who are they? I do think that it becomes pretty clear in chapter 1. Paul alludes, in fact, I'd say that he's a part of the Jewish group. Though he's not a Gentile, he identifies with the Gentiles in that he was saved in the same way that they are. It is by faith, and he was predestined. This is a topic for another video, but one of the questions I would get sometimes is, are all Jews saved? The answer is no, and I think that's part of the issue that the Apostle Paul is addressing in Galatians 4, that though they were, in a sense, children of God, adopted by God in that way, they were given the oracles of God, they need to be adopted officially, and the only way to do that is by faith in Messiah Yeshua. So you can look at Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, where Paul basically says, I can testify that many of my Jewish brethren, they're zealous for God, no doubt about it, but that zeal is not based in knowledge. So, you can do Torah all you want and, go to synagogue and worship God all you want, but unless you have the knowledge to know Jesus as Messiah, the Passover Lamb, you're not true Jews. You're not true Israelites. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, in Ephesians 2, these are verses, obviously, that precede verse 14, but Paul makes it explicit. Therefore, remember that formerly you Ephesians, the Gentiles in the flesh. So these are non-Jews, goy, but they're in the flesh. Why would Paul include that phrase? Well, because there are fences, we all call them for now, that the Jewish elite or teachers, scribes, Pharisees, and so forth, set up, and they were, you could tell they were cultural Gentiles because they had not been circumcised in the flesh. And Paul wants to point out that this is in the flesh because a flesh demarcation does not mean a spiritual change. So Gentiles in the flesh, who are called the uncircumcision, again, the topic of the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, and the topic of much of Galatians. You have the Jewish influencers who are saying if you want to be a part of the covenant community, you need to be circumcised. That was a thing for them back then. I don't have time to explain it right now, but that was a thing. They're called the uncircumcision by who? Well, by the so-called circumcision, which again is performed in the flesh by human hands. Now, most evangelicals know that true circumcision is a circumcision of the heart that doesn't happen by human hands. It happens by the indwelling Spirit that is made possible by what Jesus did on the cross as Passover Lamb. So remember that you were at that time without Messiah, Christ, alienated from the citizenship of Israel. I think that word is important. And the reason is that even though Jew and Israel would have been used interchangeably in Paul's time, almost interchangeably, who was it that was at Sinai awaiting these commandments from God? Was it the Jews? It actually wasn't. It was Israel. Jews did not become Jews until there was a divided kingdom. So you have David and then Solomon, then a divided kingdom. To the south was Judah, the dominant tribe in that area. And then you have Judah, Jews, that's why they're called Jews. And even if their hearts were not circumcised, they, by and large, as a cultural community, sought to keep the commandments of God. Now, they did it with all kinds of error and with hard hearts and added things and subtracted things that they shouldn't have done. But anyway, what was happening at Sinai, a covenant with Israel, of which you and I, Romans 9, 10, and specifically 11, are grafted into. And again, a topic for another time. And strangers to the covenants of promise. We were strangers to that. We had no hope. We were without God, but because of what Jesus did for us on the cross, we are no longer strangers to the covenant. We are now by faith. And this covenant of promise is also important because that's the point of Paul's metaphor, allegory, not sure which word, in Galatians chapter 4, when the Apostle Paul talks about Sarah and Hagar, that we need to be children of promise, not children of the slave woman. Again, another topic for another time. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were formerly far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Now, I know that for some people, at least in my world, like what's all this talk of the blood of Christ? Well, I know that sounds, a little bit harsh and stuff, but at the same time, there's a blood covenant that Yahweh inaugurated through the blood of his son, where Jesus became the sacrifice. And that in part is why the book of Hebrews is so important. I won't get into it now. Oh, so many rabbit trails I can go on. All right, now this dividing wall of the partition. Well, we could first look to the very next verse. It seems to describe what this dividing wall is. Well, it is the law of commandments contained in ordinances. And that's true. So that might be our first clue, but we mustn't jump to conclusions about what that is. Is this the Torah or is it something else? I'm going to say it's something else, and I'm going to show you why I think it's something else. Well, here's possibility number 1 of 3. It could have been the Soreg. Maybe Paul was talking about that. So here is the second temple, and you see this little fence thing. This is the court of the Gentiles here, and the Gentiles could not pass and go into this area. And there was a sign that said, "Do not pass. This is for Jews only." This is the fragment that they found. I guess there would have been a little bigger piece here, and maybe it would have been like right in this area. Again, this is just a model. But this little piece is in Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and I've not been here. It looks like a really nice place. Nice little walkways here, but look at all that square footage of artifacts. Oh, I wish I could go there, but I can't. Anyway, it's in there, and there's an inscription, and it's been translated here. "No stranger is to enter within the balustrade round the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be himself responsible for his death." So if you're a Gentile and you go past this fence, if you get stoned, that's on you. So that's basically what's going on there. Now, here's the thing is when the Apostle Paul is writing Ephesians, the Soreg is still standing. The destruction of the temple didn't happen until 70. So the verbs used over here is that this is now gone, done away with, and forever. So even though the Soreg is an apt metaphor for what Paul is talking about, that isn't what he's talking about. Well, also could be the law of God. Could these ordinances, the law of commands, look, it's a capital L, which it shouldn't be, but could it be that? Well, the possibility is yes, but I'm going to say no. Now, look, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit and tell you the Apostle Paul in the flesh, not illuminated by the Spirit, he would have been totally baffled with the idea that anyone could read these words and think that he was talking about the law of God. He'd be baffled. Now, it's happened, but as he's saying it, have you ever done this? You've said something and someone started gossiping or saying that you said something or whatever, and you're like, how in the world did what I said get morphed into that? This is the vibe that the Apostle Paul would actually feel if he heard what modern day Christians thought about what he said. He would never have meant this. Part of the reason I say that is you've got to look at the corpus of a writer. You got to know the Apostle Paul. You need to know all of his writings, take those together. He would just never would have intended that. And then there's possibility number 3, the tradition of elders. You can see this in Mark 7. "And the Pharisees and the scribes asked Jesus, 'Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of elders?'" Now, this would be later codified in the Mishnah. And even though it would be, some people might say, well, this couldn't be the law of commandments contained in ordinances because the tradition of the elders, it hadn't been codified yet. Well, let me just, I'm with Tim Hegg on this. We're going to look at Tim Hegg in just a moment. Even though it wasn't codified, it was a well-understood, well-developed thing during the time of Jesus. So you have this phrase here. This is Mishnah Oholot. And this is also an example of the tradition of the elders later codified. I'm not going to read all this apart to you, but there was this general idea that the dwelling places of non-Jews are unclean. Now, that is not, that's a fence. And it's part of the topic in Galatians chapter 2 when the Apostle Paul really gets on Peter's case. Peter knows the tradition of the elders. Peter's Jewish brethren are kind of getting, they're getting mad at Peter for like going into a house of a Gentile. And, Peter kind of caves. And the Apostle Paul's like, don't you give into those traditions of the elders. Don't do that. Don't do that. Well, on this one, I'm going to put a link below. There's some commentary on it. And, essentially, the Jewish leaders are trying to protect the Jewish people from unclean circumstances. And at issue here is miscarriages. So if you look in the Torah, to be around a dead body and blood and so forth would have been unclean. And so there was this assumption that the Gentile women, when they had miscarriages, would bury the fetus in the house. So I know that that's a hurtful thing to think about in some of your hearts. It is mine too. But that's what's going on, and that was offense, and it shouldn't have happened. But anyway, this is right in Mishnah. I'll leave a link so you can kind of study that on your own. And then this is the Damascus document. You've heard about these Qumran scrolls. I'll read this little section in its entirety, but this is essentially the writers coming against those who are erecting these fences. And as for that which Moses said, you enter to possess these nations not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your hearts, but because God loved your fathers and kept the oath, which is true. All of us are where we are. We have hope in Messiah Yeshua because in part of the covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham. Thus shall it be with the converts of Israel who depart from the way of the people, because God loved the first men, that's what it says, but it implied women, who testified in his favor, so will he love those who come after them. For the covenant of the fathers is theirs, but he hated, look at this phrase, the builders of the wall. And his anger was kindled against them and against all those who followed them. And so shall it be for all who reject the commandments of God and abandon them for the stubbornness of their hearts. Notice that the builders of the wall, the writers are not talking about the commandments of God. It's referring to the tradition of the elders that Jesus was coming against there in, for example, in Mark chapter 7. So it's the builders of the wall. They were building what was called fences. I would normally go to the coffee shop rabbi for scholarship, but I just thought this was a nice, easy way for everyone to understand it. You have the law of God, right? And they divide it into two different sections. Let me just read it to you. There are two kinds of mitzvot, commandments, good works, commandments, in Jewish practice. Those derived directly from the Torah, which we call deoraita, and those which come from the sages, which we call de rabbanan. I don't say those words all the time, but there you go. Well, the idea here is that you have the commandments of God right in the Torah, but then you have these other commandments. Now, this fence, I would say sometimes, how about this? I just don't look down on it. I just want to be aware of what it is. It's still a wall. I'm still not for the wall, but at the same time, let's be careful. Let me show you why. For me, I have a watch, and the watch is a smartwatch, and it tells me when sundown is. Tonight, I'm looking at it, 4:45. Tonight is not going to be Shabbat, but if it were, Amy and I would go, okay, sundown's at 4:45, and we might go out and get a quick bite to eat, but we want to be almost back to the house, at least by 4:45. And we want to start the Shabbat, and we know exactly when the sun is going to go down, because we want to both live into the joy that is the Sabbath. We've come to love it. I mean, who doesn't want to rest? Everyone says they're so busy, and yet Yahweh's given you exactly what you want. Here, rest. I'm not going to go into all of what it means theologically, but boy, how rich is it? But anyway, it's rest. I have my watch, Just say you're a Hebrew father back then, and you know that you want to be righteous. You want to train your kids in righteousness, but you don't have this watch. You might say to your kids, hey, you're out riding your bikes out in the neighborhood, and just when you see the sun almost down, put up 2 fingers, just, between the top of the mountain there and the sun. And when it's 2 fingers, you need to head home. Now, that's a fence, but it's a kind fence. It's training our kids, get home so that way you don't break Shabbat. Nothing wrong with that, but it's a fence. And then maybe someone came along, it's not supposed to be 2 fingers. It's supposed to be 3 fingers. And then it starts to codify, right? It gets to be so legalistic in that sense. But I appreciate the heart. Another fence law that's out there is, you don't work on the Sabbath. That is biblical. But then the Mishnah says, hey, the sages, don't pick up a tool on the Sabbath. Well, the Torah doesn't say that, but the fence, the extra law, was put there because the assumption is if you have a tool, you might forget and actually start doing some work. Well, the Torah doesn't say don't pick up the tool. And, let's just say the slight event that you turned on the tool, are you breaking the Torah? I'm not going to say that you are. What I am saying is the Torah is like, don't do work. I mean, it's a thing you don't do. So, I don't want to get into that. The bottom line is there's these fences, and the illustration is in Mark 7, and it can be filled with hypocrisy, and it misses the forest for the trees, and just shouldn't do that. Okay, so in Ephesians 2:15, back to our original text, we have the Greek here. The words I'm always concerned about are nomon here, entalon, the commandments, and then dogma here in the plural. So I think always, I think in our culture, especially evangelical culture, I think we've heard so much the age of law and the age of grace. Well, why don't we say the age of commandments or the age of ordinances? It's a law stuck for some reason. Maybe because it's a 3-letter word. I don't know. But law isn't nearly as important in the actual scriptural text as what we've made it out to be, because somehow law has become our enemy. When we think about law, what we really should be thinking about is Torah, which is basically a phrase for instruction in righteousness, which has the vibe of, if you're a dad and you're listening, and you remember when you had kids when they were like 7, 8 years old, you wanted good for them, and so you gave them instruction. I gave my kids instruction, things like, hey, treat people like you want to be treated. Don't pay interest. Don't get in credit card debt. Treat your mom kindly. It's that kind of vibe. I'm just a dad trying to give life-giving instruction to my kids. That's what the Torah is. Now, when Paul uses the word nomon, it can be the law of God, the Torah. It can be the law of sin, the law of righteousness, the law of death, all kinds of law. In other words, what you always have to do when you're reading the apostolic scriptures, the New Testament, is you need to always see how the word nomon or law is used in context. Now, what I don't like about this translation is they've capitalized law, and they shouldn't have done that because it leads the reader to believe that it's talking about the law like the Torah, and that's not what's happening. In the Greek, it's not capitalized. So I don't know why we're doing that. I think it's not, it shouldn't have done that. Well, anyway, we're going to look at dogma. And before we look at dogma, there's 5 instances in the New Testament of that word. But I want to look at Tim Hagg's commentary first. I'm going to just tell you, there's a couple places I consult before I make a video like this. One is a video by Tim Hagg. I'll leave the link. You got to pay for it down below. And he looks at this phrase contained in ordinances or contained in dogma as a qualifier for what Paul is actually getting at with the law of commandments, which makes total sense. I'm going to show you a however, is that I don't think Tim Hague, if you purchase the video, I don't think he goes far enough in one of the uses of dogma, and I'll cover that in a moment. Well, anyway, what is most important for us to recognize is how Paul describes the realm or place in which the law of commandments existed. It is in ordinances. So where are these laws? It's in the ordinances. But what is important to recognize is the Greek word Paul uses here. It is the Greek word dogma, and here in the plural. All right, that's right. What is significant about this word is that it is never used in the Septuagint. That would be the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures, more accurately, to describe any of God's commandments, judgment, statutes. I love how Hague does this, because it's not law, it's all of this. It's all of Papa's instruction, as revealed in the written Torah. Rather, in the Septuagint, LXX, dogma is always used to describe man-made laws, such as the edicts of a king or court. And here's a couple the proof texts. Now, it's not like that in the New Testament. We'll cover those in just a moment. As we cover them, I want you to be aware that there's this extra biblical example that most Greek lexicons are going to use. This is Thayer's, but this is common in any lexicon. Notice here they define, definition number 2 of dogma, the rules and requirements of the law of Moses. Well, I would think a naive reader would go and look at the lexicon and go, oh, there you go. Dogma is automatically connected to the law of Moses, and that's been abolished here in the flesh of Jesus. No, that you can't do that. And I think that the writers here have biased the text, because dogma doesn't refer to the law of Moses here, but it does in Colossians, and I'm going to show you that, and that's where I think Tim Hague, he doesn't drop the ball. He's totally right, but I would say that he should have covered Colossians in that. It would have just been helpful. But here in 3rd Maccabees, it is a apocryphal text, but the word dogma is used. We have dogma. I'm not going to try to pronounce this for you, just because I'm not all that good at it, but I am going to provide a link of the pronunciation down below, just letting you know. But anyway, this phrase in question, 3rd Maccabees, Ptolemy, is essentially going to try to walk into the Holy of Holies, and the people are not going to have it, and there's an issue there. So interesting story, but I'm not going to go over the story now. Anyway, Josephus, there's the translation. This is the 2012 version here. Josephus, by birth a Jew, afterward a renegade from the laws and observances, dogma of his country. In other words, the ordinances are ordinances of a governmental group. So in other words, what I want you to see here is that this is not the law of Moses in the translation. It is the law contained in ordinances of Josephus's country. And I've looked at other translations. Most of them are going to use of his country, but some will use something else. Can't remember off the top of my head, but it's not of Moses. Why that's included in Thayer's that way, I don't know. I don't know those people. Anyway, this is now the second New Testament text, the first one being Ephesians 2 here. But here we have dogma, so it is a decree, but this is from Caesar Augustus, okay? So it's not the law of Moses, it's from Caesar. The next is Acts 16:4. These are the decrees decided upon by the apostles and elders. So I'm going to say this is something we should pay attention to. Acts 15, when you have the Jerusalem Council and they have this doctrine, this letter, these are things we should pay attention to. I got no problem with that. Okay. Acts 17:7, decrees of who? Caesar, not of God, not of Moses. All right, so it's used in conjunction somewhere else, and then this one is used in conjunction with the law of God. So having blotted out the handwriting that was against us and the decrees which was adverse to us, and I'm going to say that is the law of God. It was adverse to us, and it was taken out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. What's the it? It is the decrees against us. It is not the law itself. Here's how it works. In Corinthians, the Apostle Paul is going to say that the law functions as a ministry of death. So, maybe you're a Christian, you're like, well, I don't want to be a part of a ministry of death. Well, okay, me neither. However, I'm appreciative of the ministry of death because that's one of the functions of the Torah. It's designed to tell you what sin is. That's the topic for the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 7 and 8. You can go read it. And Paul, this will trigger your memory. How would I know what coveting was if the law said do not covet? Well, what's the point there? It killed me. The law killed me. It told me that I was rotten through and through because of a transgression, a manifestation of what was inside of my heart. It manifested in covetousness, and it pointed it out. And it killed me by doing that. It pointed out my death. It showed me that I was in need of a Savior, a Messiah. So the decrees, it condemned you, all right? It pointed out your sin. Now, does sin cease to be sin now that you've become a believer? No. So now there's no longer any condemnation, right? So again, Romans. But the idea here is that what was nailed to the cross is the condemnation. The ministry of death is no longer functional in your life because now you have the privilege, the joy of walking in life. Death has been wiped out because of what Jesus has done for us as the Passover lamb on the cross. The certificate of debt has been nailed to the cross. Now, does sin cease to be sin because you're a believer? No, coveting's still a sin. It doesn't condemn you, but now don't go covet, don't go steal, murder, don't go eat pork or any other unclean animal. Don't worship God in pagan ways. So those things are still for us, but the condemnation is no longer there. All right. In Ephesians 2:15, our text, ordinances, these things having annulled. Now, I am going to camp out here just for a moment because this word is also important to us. What's being annulled? Well, the law of commandments contained in these ordinances. In Jesus, they go away. Now, I do want to remind you, even though this is a little bit different word, Jesus says, hey, don't come to think that I've come to abolish the law or destroy the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish it, but to pleroo, to fulfill it, to do it. This doesn't mean to end it. It means that he came because that's what the law pointed to the whole time and continues to point to the whole time. So Jesus shows us how to do it and do it rightly by the Spirit. But this is the exact word where the Apostle Paul, Romans 3:31, then do we nullify the law through faith? May it never be. Instead, we're to do it. We're to uphold it. We're to walk in it. So again, this is the exact word here. And if it's the exact word and Paul is using it to say that we do not nullify the law, well, why would he go on and say then we're going to nullify the law of Moses here? That's not what he's saying. Again, not in a million years would he have thought that anyone would have thought that. So now we have all these pieces together, and I think we can answer these questions. Who is the he? That is Yahweh, but Jesus and Yeshua are implied for sure. Who are these two groups? They're Jew and Gentile in the way that Paul's audience would have understood it. Again, you had cultural Jews, but if you continue in Paul's reading, he will differentiate cultural Jews or the influencers from those who are true Israel. And again, a topic for another time. Now, this question, what's the dividing wall? I'm going to shift this. I think a better question is who built this dividing wall, because that clues us into what the dividing wall actually is, and that would be the hypocritical elders, scribes, Pharisees. Now, again, I do think that there are fences that were designed in a healthy, good way to protect Jewish children that were trying to follow the Torah. I get that, but at the same time, they got full of themselves, went way too far, and they built up this wall. And the Qumran scrolls in the Damascus document calls them on it explicitly. And then what are these law contained in ordinances? It's the tradition of the elders. And what I wanted to show in this video is how I would come up with that. In other words, so many people that don't know me or don't know, the Torah movement, I guess. I don't like that phrase, but I'm in love with Jesus, period. And Jesus is my king. And Jesus even says in John 14:15, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. I mean, why would I not want to obey those commandments? I don't want to walk in sin. That brings death to me. I don't want to give the members of my body over to unrighteousness. I want to give the members of my body over to the things that my king thinks is righteous. I let God determine the good and evil, not me. Adam and Eve, they messed up in that. I don't want to keep messing up. And by the Spirit, not of my own works. I don't sanctify myself, but not of my own works. And I've been saved by grace through faith, not of my works, of my mitzvot, of following the commandments. But because I am saved, I want to give the members of my body over to righteousness. And there was a dividing wall. Now, here's the thing, is a lot of reason I think people mess this up is because this is not such an issue for today. But in Paul's time, it was a huge issue. There are a lot of people coming to faith in Messiah, and they were being told by the busybodies, you better get circumcised or you're not really in. Or, you better hold up your 3 fingers to the sun. I'm making that up. Or you better not hold that tool or you're not doing it right. And that was the fence of hypocrisy. And Paul is saying that wall that was created by the builders of the wall, the Torah, the oracles of God were given to Israel, which later became the Jews, to be a blessing to the nations. And they didn't do a lot of blessing. And in the middle of all that, there was a wall built up between Jew and Gentile. And in what Jesus did for us, it was brought down forever. And Paul is trying to communicate that to the Ephesian folks. All right, I think that's about enough for today. I hope that was of benefit to you. If you have anything to add, I'm gonna probably redo these videos at some point and explain it better. There's something I could have done better to better communicate these ideas. Let me know down below, or any fixes or whatever. That'd be great. Other than that, I will see you in the next video. And I do want to remind you, the reason we call it Everyday Torah is because these are life-giving commandments that Yahweh has given to us as our Abba, our Daddy. And he said, just kind of, you want to walk in life? Walk in these every day of your life, and it will go well with you. It doesn't earn us anything, but these are given for our benefit, and that way we might grow closer to our Messiah. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. See you next time.